Iran's global image problem remains one of the most entrenched and misunderstood dynamics in modern geopolitics. Despite its long history, rich culture, and strategic importance, Iran continues to be viewed by much of the world, especially the West, as a pariah state. This negative image is rooted in a complex blend of historical events, ideological conflicts, domestic policies, and international power plays. Over time, Iran has become increasingly isolated, not just because of its actions, but also due to how it is portrayed and perceived globally. The roots of Iran's modern reputation trace back to the 1979 Islamic Revolution. This was a turning point that transformed Iran from a pro-Western monarchy under the Shah into a theocratic state led by Ayatollah Khomeini. While the revolution was welcomed by many Iranians as an overthrow of dictatorship, it sent shockwaves through the West. The storming of the US embassy in Tehran and the holding of American diplomats hostage for 444 days shaped Western views of Iran for generations. From that point forward, Iran was often seen not as a sovereign nation with legitimate concerns, but as a symbol of anti-Western extremism and religious militancy. This perception has been reinforced by Iran's foreign policy, particularly its support for groups that many Western nations classify as terrorist organizations. Iran has maintained alliances with Hezbollah in Lebanon, various Shia militias in Iraq and Syria, and Hamas in Gaza. While Iran argues that these groups are resistance movements fighting against occupation and oppression, Western governments view this support as proof of Iran's destabilizing role in the Middle East. In addition, Iran's open hostility toward Israel and inflammatory rhetoric by past leaders have further fueled fear and condemnation. Iran's nuclear program has also been a major source of global anxiety. Although Tehran has repeatedly stated that its nuclear ambitions are peaceful, designed for energy and medical purposes, there is widespread suspicion about its true intentions. The 2015 Iran nuclear deal, known as the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action (JCPOA), was a breakthrough in diplomacy, with Iran agreeing to scale back its nuclear activities in exchange for sanctions relief. However, when the United States pulled out of the deal in 2018 under President Donald Trump, it reignited international tensions. Many countries became wary of trusting Iran again, especially when Western media highlighted Iran's resumed uranium enrichment as a threat rather than a response to US withdrawal. Domestically, Iran's policies have also contributed significantly to its global image problem. The Islamic Republic is frequently criticized for its human rights record, particularly its treatment of women, political prisoners, journalists, and ethnic minorities. The suppression of peaceful protests, censorship of media, and harsh punishments for dissent have all drawn international condemnation. These actions make it difficult for other nations to openly support Iran or advocate for engagement, even when humanitarian issues arise. It creates a narrative where the Iranian people are seen as victims of their own government and the regime as a repressive force unwilling to reform. The structure of Iran's government adds to the problem. While there are elections and a president, the real power lies with unelected bodies such as the Supreme Leader and the Guardian Council. This clerical control gives the impression of a rigid, authoritarian system that does not reflect the will of its people. As a result, efforts by reformist politicians within Iran are often overlooked or undermined. Both at home and abroad, international media coverage plays a critical role in cementing Iran's image. Western outlets tend to focus on conflict, nuclear threats, and extremist slogans rather than highlighting Iran's complex society, educated youth, vibrant arts, or technological advancements. This one-sided portrayal contributes to widespread misunderstanding. Meanwhile, Iranian state media often mirrors this problem by promoting anti-Western narratives and failing to present Iran's own diversity and potential. Geopolitical interests also influence how Iran is treated on the world stage. US alliances with countries like Saudi Arabia and Israel create a strategic incentive to isolate Iran. These regional rivals frequently lobby against Iran in international forums and shape the global discourse around it. Sanctions, diplomatic pressure, and military threats are tools used not only to contain Iran's actions, but also to ensure it remains politically weak. The result of all this is a nation trapped by both its own policies and a global narrative that rarely allows space for change. Even in times of crisis, such as earthquakes, floods, or during the COVID-19 pandemic, Iran often struggles to receive international aid due to sanctions or political hesitation. The Iranian people, many of whom seek peace, prosperity, and reform, are the ones who suffer the most from this isolation. Improving Iran's image requires changes on both sides. Iran needs to show genuine progress on human rights, transparency, and diplomacy. At the same time, the international community must be willing to look beyond headlines and past conflicts to engage constructively. Only through mutual effort can Iran break free from the cycle of mistrust and rejoin the global community as a respected and responsible nation. Double standards in international politics refer to the practice of applying different principles to similar situations, depending on who is involved, or what interests are at stake, or which alliances are in play. It's a long-standing and deeply entrenched reality of global affairs, where powerful nations enforce norms and values selectively to preserve their own strategic advantages. This inconsistency is often cloaked in the language of democracy, human rights, or peacekeeping, but in practice, it reveals a clear pattern of favoritism and hypocrisy that undermines the credibility of international law and institutions. A prominent example of double standards can be seen in how the international community reacts to different countries accused of similar actions. And when a Western ally engages in human rights violations, military aggression, or censorship, the global response is often muted or rationalized. Conversely, and when a rival or non-aligned state behaves similarly, it is swiftly condemned, sanctioned, or even threatened with intervention. This selective enforcement sends a message that global norms are not universal, but rather tools used to pressure adversaries while shielding friends. The US invasion of Iraq in 2003, based on disputed claims of weapons of mass destruction, was widely criticized, but ultimately were headed without any meaningful consequences for the decision makers involved. In contrast, countries like Iran or North Korea have faced crippling sanctions and international isolation for far less probable or differently framed threats. This selective application of justice weakens international institutions such as the United Nations, which are supposed to provide a neutral framework for global cooperation and accountability. When these bodies are seen to function under the influence of powerful nations, their legitimacy and moral authority are significantly diminished. Another striking example involves nuclear proliferation. The international community, led by the United States and European powers, has taken a hardline stance against Iran's nuclear ambitions, demanding strict limitations and inspections. Yet countries like Israel, India, and Pakistan, all of whom have developed nuclear weapons outside of the Non-Proliferation Treaty framework, have not faced similar levels of scrutiny or sanctions. This inconsistency is often justified by citing strategic alliances or regional stability, but the underlying message is clear. Some countries are permitted to bend or break the rules without consequence, while others are punished harshly for even perceived violations. Human rights discourse is also riddled with double standards. Authoritarian governments allied with powerful states often escape criticism despite clear abuses. Saudi Arabia, for instance, has faced relatively little international backlash for its internal repression, treatment of women, and involvement in the humanitarian crisis in Yemen. In contrast, countries like Venezuela or Syria have been heavily sanctioned and isolated under the banner of promoting democracy and human rights. This uneven approach not only undermines the cause of human rights, but also discredits those who claim to champion them. It becomes evident that rights are sometimes invoked not as universal principles, but as political weapons. The handling of protests and civil unrest further illustrates these double standards. When uprisings occur in adversarial countries, such as in Iran or China, and they are quickly framed as heroic struggles for freedom by international media and political leaders. However, when similar protests happen in allied states or within Western democracies themselves, the response is often far more cautious and sometimes even repressive. the treatment of movements like Black Lives Matter in the US, or the Yellow Vests in France reveals that governments often prioritize order over the rights of protesters when it suits domestic stability. Even while condemning other nations for doing the same, these inconsistencies are not just morally problematic, they are strategically short-sighted. They breed resentment, fuel anti-Western sentiment, and erode the effectiveness of diplomacy. Countries subject to double standards often view international norms as tools of domination rather than as shared principles, leading them to disengage from multilateral frameworks or pursue more aggressive policies in defense of their sovereignty. Moreover, double standards give authoritarian regimes ammunition to dismiss legitimate criticism as politically motivated, thus strengthening their grip on power and weakening domestic reform movements. Ultimately, double standards in international politics are a reflection of a world still governed by power hierarchies rather than equal principles. While realpolitik and national interest have always been part of foreign policy, the open contradiction between stated values and actual behavior is increasingly visible and damaging in a globally connected age. For the international order to be seen as just and legitimate, the same standards must apply to all, friends and foes alike. Until that happens, and the promise of a fair and rule-based global system will remain unfulfilled, and the world will continue to grapple with instability, mistrust, and conflict. And the United States has long relied on sanctions and diplomatic isolation as central tools of its foreign policy, especially against countries it views as threats to its global interests. Unlike military intervention, which carries high political and human costs, sanctions are framed as a non-violent way to compel change in a target nation's behavior. While they are promoted as a strategic alternative to war, EU-led sanctions often result in economic devastation, humanitarian crises, and political hardening within the targeted states. These measures, rather than achieving their stated goals of promoting democracy, reducing nuclear threats, or curbing regional aggression, frequently produce outcomes that contradict US intentions. Sanctions typically involve restrictions on trade, financial transactions, and access to global markets. In the case of Iran, for example, US sanctions have targeted its oil exports, banking sector, and critical industries, severely damaging the country's economy. The stated justification for these sanctions has shifted over the years, from punishing Iran for its nuclear program to limiting its regional influence or supporting domestic opposition movements. Yet, despite decades of pressure, Iran remains defiant and has even expanded some of its controversial activities, partly as a direct response to being cut off from the global economy and security architecture. This strategy often extends beyond bilateral pressure. The US uses its economic dominance and control over global financial systems, such as the SOF banking network and the US dollar's role as the world's reserve currency, to coerce other nations into compliance. Secondary sanctions threaten non-US companies or countries with penalties if they engage in business with a targeted nation. This extraterritorial application of US law has led to tensions even with allies in Europe and Asia, many of whom oppose such measures but feel compelled to follow them due to the risks of exclusion from US markets. The isolation strategy doesn't end with sanctions alone. Diplomatic efforts are made to remove countries like Iran, Venezuela, or North Korea from key international forums. Travel bans, asset freezes, and restrictions on educational, scientific, or cultural exchange often accompany the economic measures. This approach aims to delegitimize the regimes and deny them international recognition. However, it also cuts off populations from opportunities to engage with the world, further entrenching authoritarian rule by shrinking the space for cross-border collaboration or reform. One of the primary criticisms of US and led sanctions is their humanitarian impact. While officials argue that sanctions are designed to target regimes and not ordinary citizens, the reality on the ground is often different. In Iran, for instance, sanctions have led to skyrocketing inflation, medicine shortages, and widespread economic hardship. The middle and lower classes bear the brunt of these measures, while political elites often find ways to bypass restrictions through informal networks or black markets. Instead of sparking popular uprisings, sanctions can deepen public cynicism toward both domestic governments and Western powers, as people associate their suffering with external aggression rather than internal mismanagement. Another unintended consequence of the isolation strategy is strategic realignment. Countries that are cut off from Western markets and institutions often turn toward rival powers such as China or Russia for support. This shifts the global balance of power and reduces the effectiveness of sanctions over time. Iran's deepening ties with China and military cooperation with Russia are examples of how prolonged isolation can drive adversaries closer together, creating new geopolitical blocs that challenge US dominance. In attempting to isolate one threat, the US may inadvertently fuel the rise of a multipolar world where its influence is diminished. Furthermore, the long-term effectiveness of sanctions is questionable. In many cases, they have failed to achieve their primary goals. North Korea remains a nuclear state despite decades of sanctions. Venezuela's leadership has not collapsed despite being cut off from much of the world economy. Cuba has remained defiant under a near-total embargo that has lasted over 60 years. These examples suggest that sanctions often become more of a symbolic gesture of disapproval than a practical instrument of change. In some cases, they even strengthen the targeted regime by allowing leaders to frame themselves as victims of foreign aggression, thereby justifying repression and rallying nationalist sentiment. One of the less acknowledged but powerful reasons why many countries and organizations hesitate to support Iran, even during times of crisis, is the fear of backlash. This fear stems from the geopolitical environment dominated by powerful players, primarily the United States and its allies, who maintain a hardline stance against Iran. Nations and institutions that consider aligning with or even assisting Iran, whether diplomatically, economically, or through humanitarian aid, often weigh the consequences of going against this dominant narrative. The risk includes economic sanctions, diplomatic pressure, loss of strategic partnerships, and being perceived as opposing the West's broader agenda in the Middle East. The United States has established an extensive framework of primary and secondary sanctions that not only target Iran directly, but also extend to any entity doing business with it. This means that companies and even governments can be penalized for engaging in trade, banking, or investment activities involving Iran. For example, after the US unilaterally withdrew from the Iran nuclear deal JCPOA in 2018, it reimposed severe sanctions on Iran and warned other countries and corporations that continuing business with Tehran would make them targets of similar penalties. This forced many European, Asian, and multinational firms to abandon deals and projects in Iran, not because of their own policies or moral considerations, but due to the overwhelming fear of losing access to the US financial system. This fear isn't limited to businesses. Governments, too, face strategic dilemmas. Nations in Europe and Asia that may have political or economic interest in cooperating with Iran often hesitate to take active steps due to potential strain on their relations with the United States. For example, during humanitarian crises in Iran, such as the COVID-19 pandemic or natural disasters like earthquakes, many countries were cautious about sending aid or medical supplies, fearing that even humanitarian assistance might be interpreted as violating US sanctions. Despite provisions for humanitarian exceptions, the fear of regulatory complexity and punitive actions discourages many actors from getting involved. Furthermore, supporting Iran openly can come with reputational costs in the realm of global politics. Iran has been portrayed for decades as a threat to regional stability, a state sponsor of terrorism, and an opponent of Western values. This narrative has been cemented in international media and diplomatic forums, making it politically unpopular to be seen as sympathetic to the Iranian state. Political leaders who advocate for engagement with Iran often face criticism at home and abroad, accused of appeasing a hostile regime or undermining the interests of allies such as Israel or Saudi Arabia. The domestic politics of countries also play a significant role in shaping this fear. In democratic states, Public opinion influenced by media and historical memory, such as the 1979 embassy hostage crisis or Iran's fiery anti-Israel rhetoric, creates a hostile environment for any policy seen as soft on Iran. Politicians, therefore, are reluctant to appear supportive, even when strategic interests might suggest engagement. In autocratic or less democratic nations, the governments might still avoid ties with Iran due to broader alignment with Western power structures or reliance on Western aid, trade, or security support. There is also an institutional dimension to this fear. International organizations, including banks, non-profits, and academic institutions, often self-censor or disengage from opportunities related to Iran due to compliance risks. Universities may avoid academic exchange. Researchers may fear collaboration, and NGOs might pull back from humanitarian projects because of complicated legal environments and ambiguous guidelines. The effect is a broad isolation that extends for beyond government policy, creating an environment where very few are willing to take the risk of even neutral or a political cooperation with Iran. In such an environment, even when Iran faces legitimate needs, such as natural disasters, public health emergencies, or economic reform efforts, many in the international community remain silent or inactive. The fear of being seen as pro-Iran overshadows basic humanitarian responsibility. This leads to a cycle in which Iran becomes further isolated, its domestic situation worsens, and hardliners within the country gain strength by framing the West as hypercritical and hostile. Meanwhile, the moderates and reformists, who could serve as bridges for engagement, are undermined by the lack of international support. This atmosphere of fear stifles diplomacy and creates a chilling effect where rational, strategic engagement with Iran is avoided in favor of self-preservation and political correctness. While concerns about Iran's policies are real and often valid, the reluctance to engage based on fear of clash prevents constructive efforts that might contribute to de-escalation, regional cooperation, and the well-being of Iranian citizens. In this way, fear itself becomes a barrier to progress, reducing the space for dialogue and entrenching positions that make peaceful resolution and mutual understanding harder to achieve.